When we study the history of the Second World War, we are often presented with a narrative of armies and generals, of strategy and logistics, of men who, despite fighting for a monstrous regime, still operated within the recognizable boundaries of military structure. But history also has dark corners that defy conventional understanding. There are stories that are so bleak, so devoid of any military logic or basic humanity, that even the architects of the Third Reich tried to distance themselves from them. This is the story of one of those corners. This is the story of a man who was not a military genius, not a strategist, and not a dedicated soldier. He was a convicted criminal who was handed a uniform, given absolute power over life and death, and placed in command of a unit comprised of the worst society had to offer. His name was Oskar Dirlewanger. Among the men who fought on the Eastern Front, his name became a watchword for absolute terror. His methods were so extreme, his disregard for human life so absolute, that even other high-ranking SS officers were disgusted by him and repeatedly tried to have him court-martialed. Yet, he survived, protected by the very top of the Nazi hierarchy. To understand Oskar Dirlewanger is to understand the terrifying reality of what happens when a totalitarian system completely abandons morality and arms the monsters it had previously locked away in its own prisons. To trace the origins of this nightmare, we have to go back to a time before the Third Reich even existed. Oskar Dirlewanger was born in September 1895 in the city of Würzburg, Germany, into a relatively normal, middle-class family. When the First World War broke out in 1914, he joined the Imperial German Army like millions of other young men. In the trenches of the Western Front, he proved to be a capable and fearless soldier. He was wounded multiple times, commanded an infantry company, and was awarded the Iron Cross. If his life had ended there, or if he had simply gone home and faded into obscurity, he would have been remembered merely as another veteran of the Great War. But 1918 broke Oskar Dirlewanger, just as it broke countless others. He returned to a Germany that was collapsing. The empire he had fought for was gone, replaced by the chaotic and politically unstable Weimar Republic. Unable to adjust to civilian life, Dirlewanger joined the Freikorps, right-wing paramilitary groups composed of angry veterans who fought bloody street battles against communists and political rivals across Germany. Violence had become the only language he understood. As the 1920s bled into the 1930s, Dirlewanger's life completely unraveled. He became an alcoholic. He drifted from job to job, unable to maintain any sense of normalcy. He joined the Nazi Party early on, hoping to find a place among the extreme nationalists, but even there, his behavior was a problem. In 1934, his life hit rock bottom. He was arrested, convicted of the statutory rape of a minor, and sent to prison. Under German law, this conviction meant he was stripped of his military rank, stripped of his medals, and expelled from the Nazi Party. After serving his sentence, he was briefly sent to a concentration camp. In any functioning society, Oskar Dirlewanger's story would have ended right there. He was a disgraced, convicted criminal. But Dirlewanger had a lifeline, and that lifeline was a man named Gottlob Berger. Berger had served with Dirlewanger in the First World War, and by the late 1930s, Berger had risen to become one of the most powerful men in the SS, serving directly under Heinrich Himmler as the head of the SS main leadership office. Berger remembered his old comrade, and he pulled strings. He managed to get Dirlewanger released, helped him get his military record partially restored, and even sent him to Spain to fight with the Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War as a way to rehabilitate his image. By 1940, the Second World War had begun, and the SS was expanding rapidly. Berger proposed a bizarre and highly unorthodox idea to Heinrich Himmler. The prisons of Germany were full of convicted poachers, men who had been locked up for illegally hunting game. Berger argued that these men, despite being criminals, were excellent marksmen and expert trackers who knew how to survive in the wild. Why waste them in prison when they could be put to use? Himmler agreed, and the man chosen to lead this new, experimental penal unit was Oskar Dirlewanger. Initially, the unit was small, known as the Poachers' Command. They were sent to occupied Poland, ostensibly to hunt down partisans and resistance fighters hiding in the dense forests. But from the very beginning, the unit was a disaster of discipline. The men were essentially given free rein, and under Dirlewanger's command, they quickly devolved into a heavily armed gang. They looted, they extorted local populations, and they engaged in rampant corruption. It got so bad that the local German civilian administrators and regular SS police units complained bitterly to Berlin. Any other commander would have been shot for the sheer chaos he was causing. SS judges actually investigated Dirlewanger and recommended severe punishment. But Gottlob Berger intervened again, shielding his old friend from the consequences. Instead of being disbanded, the unit was simply moved further east, into the vast, unforgiving territory of Belarus, after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. It was in Belarus that the Dirlewanger Brigade evolved into something truly horrifying. The war on the Eastern Front was not a conventional war. It was an ideological war of annihilation. The vast forests and swamps of Belarus had become a stronghold for Soviet partisans who constantly harassed German supply lines. The German military struggled to deal with this invisible enemy, and they turned to extreme measures. Dirlewanger's unit was tasked with pacifying the region. By this time, the unit had fundamentally changed. It was no longer just poachers. Because of the massive casualties the German army was taking, the SS began scraping the bottom of the barrel to fill Dirlewanger's ranks. They emptied military prisons. They brought in men who had been court-martialed for severe crimes: murder, assault, insubordination. And eventually, they even began recruiting hardened criminals and psychopaths straight from civilian concentration camps. If a man was deemed too violent or too unmanageable for regular society, he was handed a rifle and sent to Dirlewanger. Commanding this army of the condemned, Oskar Dirlewanger unleashed a campaign of terror that almost defies belief. Because partisans were difficult to find and fight in the forests, Dirlewanger simply targeted the civilian population that he suspected of supporting them. His unit would surround entire Belarusian villages. In a chilling, mechanized routine of death, they would lock the inhabitants, men, women, and children, inside barns or large wooden churches. They would then set the buildings on fire, using machine guns to cut down anyone who tried to escape the flames. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that the Dirlewanger Brigade was responsible for the destruction of over 200 villages in Belarus alone, and the murder of tens of thousands of unarmed civilians. They turned vast swathes of the country into depopulated, scorched earth. Yet, even within the brutal apparatus of the SS, Dirlewanger was viewed with disgust. regular army commanders refused to operate alongside his unit. SS judges, including a famous investigator named Conrad Morgan, gathered evidence against Dirlewanger, documenting his unauthorized murders, his corruption, and his complete lack of military discipline. They pleaded with Himmler to have Dirlewanger executed, but Himmler, influenced by Berger, looked the other way. In the twisted logic of the Nazi leadership, Dirlewanger was doing the dirty work that no one else wanted to do. He was terrifying, yes, but he was creating the terror that Berlin demanded. The absolute pinnacle of the unit's infamy, however, would come in August 1944. As the Red Army approached the Vistula River, the Polish Home Army launched a massive, coordinated uprising to liberate their capital city of Warsaw. It was one of the largest and most desperate urban battles of the entire war. The German garrison in the city was caught off guard, and Heinrich Himmler ordered that the uprising be crushed with maximum brutality. He famously decreed that every inhabitant was to be killed and the city razed to the ground as a terrifying example to the rest of Europe. To execute this order, Himmler sent his most brutal suppressors, and among them was the Dirlewanger brigade. When Dirlewanger's men entered the Wola district of Warsaw, what followed was not urban combat. It was a massacre on an industrial scale. Unconstrained by any rules of engagement, and facing mostly unarmed civilians and lightly armed insurgents, the brigade went from street to street, house to house, basement to basement. Over the course of just a few days in early August 1944, tens of thousands of Polish civilians were systematically executed. It remains one of the deadliest single massacres of civilians in the history of the Second World War. The violence perpetrated by Dirlewanger's men in Warsaw was so chaotic and so extreme that it actively hindered the German military effort. The German general in charge of suppressing the uprising, Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, a man who was himself a ruthless war criminal, actually begged his superiors to withdraw Dirlewanger's unit from the city. Bach-Zelewski argued that Dirlewanger's men were so focused on slaughter and looting that they were useless for actual military operations against the hardened Polish resistance fighters. Eventually, the unit was moved out of the city, but the damage was done. For his actions in Warsaw, a campaign that consisted almost entirely of murdering civilians, Oskar Dirlewanger was awarded the Knight's Cross. It was a sick testament to the values of the regime he served, a regime that handed its highest military honors to a man who had orchestrated the slaughter of innocents. But the Third Reich was dying, and Dirlewanger's luck was about to run out. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Red Army was pushing relentlessly into Eastern Europe. The German military was desperate for manpower. The Dirlewanger Brigade was officially upgraded to the status of an SS division, though it rarely had the numbers to justify the title. They were thrown into the front line in Slovakia and Hungary, ordered to hold the line against regular, heavily armed Soviet combat troops. It was a disaster. A unit composed of convicted criminals, psychopaths, and men who had only ever fought unarmed civilians suddenly found itself facing tanks, artillery, and hardened Soviet infantry. They had no cohesion, no morale, and no desire to die for Germany. As soon as the heavy fighting started, the division essentially disintegrated. Entire battalions deserted. Men shot their own officers and fled into the woods. They suffered catastrophic casualties, proving that while they were experts at terrorizing the defenseless, They were completely incapable of fighting a real war. Dirlewanger himself did not stay to share the fate of his men. In February 1945, he was wounded in the chest during fighting in Germany. He was evacuated to the rear, completely abandoning the remnants of his division. As the war ended in May 1945, and the high-ranking members of the regime desperately tried to flee or commit suicide, Dirlewanger opted to hide. He stripped off his SS uniform, acquired civilian clothes, and adopted a false name. He hid out in a remote hunting lodge in southern Germany, hoping that the chaos of the post-war occupation would allow him to slip away into history unnoticed. But history has a way of catching up to men like Oskar Dirlewanger. In June 1945, he was recognized. French occupation forces arrested him and transferred him to a prison camp in the town of Altshausen. He was placed in a cell, awaiting what would undoubtedly have been a trial resulting in a death sentence. But Oskar Dirlewanger never made it to a courtroom. On the 7th of June, 1945, he died in his cell. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, but the reality was far darker. Historians and eyewitness accounts widely agree that Dirlewanger was brutally beaten to death by his guards over the course of several days. According to multiple reports, some of those guards were former Polish prisoners who knew exactly who they had in their custody. The man who had unleashed so much suffering, who had lived his life by violence and absolute cruelty, died alone on the floor of a prison cell, beaten to death by the very people his regime had tried to exterminate. The story of Oskar Dirlewanger is not an easy one to tell. There is no heroism here. There is no military genius to analyze, no tragic flaw to debate. He was a man who embodied the absolute worst impulses of humanity. But his story is vital because it serves as a historical warning. The Dirlewanger Brigade was not an accident. It was the logical conclusion of a system that valued ideology over morality and obedience over humanity. Oskar Dirlewanger was exactly what the Third Reich created when it decided that some lives had no value. That is his story, and now you know it.